Well, hello again, folks. Howdy, howdy. This is your old buddy Luther Thrift. Some know me as the old swamper. Uh, last time Chad was here, we talked about Trembling Earth. He wanted to know about the origin of Trembling Earth, in which I told him, and he liked that. And I got to thinking about uh, what happened to Uncle Jim Hendrix one time, right after the war between the states. He came home, and he was in a group, uh, artillery, and he went over to Savannah, and we'll talk about that, his experience coming home. But since we were talking about label book now. Since we were talking about Trembling Earth, Uncle Dave was in the swamp right early one morning, and he was poling along, and it began coming daylight, and he got to see in the fog, and all of a sudden he saw it look like some men on a floating battery. Now, the floating battery that he saw in his mind went back to the Savannah River during the war. And since the Confederacy didn't have enough cannon to cover all of the crossings along the river, they put some of them on big boats and floated them up and down the river where they thought they might need them. Some of them were on rafts. And so if they thought the Yankees was going to cross at a certain place, they'd pull a raft down there, and they had some artillery to help stop them. Well, this particular morning, I guess his mind flashed back. He saw this, what he looked like several men and pulling a raft, and he said he could even see the cannon on there. And then all of a sudden, as it got closer and it got clearer, he could see it wasn't nothing but a big hunk of peat that was floating down the stream. And as I said before, a lot of times when you have heavy rains, some of that stuff will break up and pieces of it will hit the main run and float down it. So anyway, he ran into that, what he saw about the floating battery. And then when he went back home, he had got everybody excited. He said, "Boy, my mind sure is slipping on me." He said, "I thought sure I saw a floating battery this morning, but it wasn't nothing but a big hunk of peat with one or two little saplings on it." Well, that was Uncle Jim Hendrix, and he was the progenitor of a big family of Hendrixes. Of course, he lived over in Charlton County for a while, and then he moved over here along about the 1870s. He moved over here down the road here, right down the Swamp Road, and not far from Obadiah Barber. He and Obadiah Barber were big buddies at hunting, especially hog hunting. They helped one another hunt their hogs and their cows. And Uncle Jim, well, maybe we ought to go back and tell the story about when he was in Savannah while we owned Jim Hendrix. Jim Hendrix was captured just a boy, I think about 15 years old. And Ronnie, we don't need you out here. Jim Hendrix was captured and was under guard in a big tent. He said he looked out the flap of the tent, and there was the old Yankee with his head leaning on his musket and about asleep. And so he said, "Now's the time for me to get away from this place." And some of the men, they were all sleeping in the tent, but they had Jim worried. He had overheard some of them talking about they were going to shoot him the next morning. And I don't know if some of his older comrades were just trying to scare him, or he actually heard one of the Yankees say that maybe they ought to shoot him. But anyway, when he saw the old Yankee guard was about asleep, and everybody else was asleep, so he slipped under the flap of the tent and ran. And he ran a few miles, and directly he heard a horse coming down the road, coming towards him. So he hid in the bushes, and just as the old horse approached, he saw that it was a horse with a bridle and saddle, and no rider. So he, being a horseman himself, and knowing how to handle animals, he eased up to the old horse and talked to him, and caught the reins and jumped in the saddle. And he said, "Now's the time to go home." So he came home, lived over there in Charlton County, where Folkestone is now. And he kept that horse hid most of the time, because after the war, Reconstruction came into being, and we were under federal rule, the Yankee rule, sure enough then. But he kept that horse till the horse died. And of course, Uncle Jim then later moved around here by Obadiah, but he had, I think it was about 15 children, and most of the Hendrixes now you see around here. He married Nancy Lane, I think was the mama of most of them. Hamp Mazells married one of his daughters, and then she had one of the best historians came out of that family, out the Jim Hendrix family. Aunt Rhoda Barber, Rhoda Mazel Barber, whose mama was a Hendrix. Jim Hendrix actually was her granddad. And she used to tell me a lot of swamp stories. We'll get on Hamp Mazel here sometime in the future. But anyway, Uncle Jim and Obadiah were big buddies, and of course they both lived to be old men. But we had some other old timers down there. Talk about Confederate veterans. Well, Obadiah and Jim were both Confederate soldiers. Obadiah was in the cavalry, and he and Uncle Jim, well, matter of fact, he loaned Uncle Jim a horse one time. That's another story. They met in Waycross right after the war, and Uncle Jim was coming home, and he said he met Obadiah, and he said, "I'm on my way home." He said, "Well, we just come up here, not at Waycross, I'm sorry, at Waresboro, and or 09. Had to be 09. Anyway, and he said, "Jim, how are you traveling?" He said, "On my 2 feet, just like I left when they turned us loose." He said, "I'll make it home probably in a couple of days. It'd take me 2 days to walk to Folkestone." He said, "You ain't got to go that walking." He said, "I tell you what, my boy here, Jim is riding the mule, and me and the wife and the other young'uns in the wagon." He said, "Why don't you just take my mule and ride him home?" Now at this time, Obadiah, a lot of people think of Obadiah living down where the Obadiah homestead is. At this time, Obadiah was living over near the where on US 1 is now. Matter of fact, trying to think of the exact place. He bought the place over there when he first came to Ware County in 1856. He was here before the war, and he came over and bought a place over there from a cruise fella, and not far there from the US 1 highway today. Anyway, he loaned him the mule, and then the story goes on that Jim Hendrix sent the mule back to him later on, or he sent his boys to get the mule. But I was trying to think of another old veteran. I know who could just come to mind. Old Uncle Dave Carter. Uncle Dave Carter was an interesting fella. He was in the, I think it was the 50th Georgia Infantry, and he got up there in Virginia and got sick on him after a battle or so. I don't know if it he caught some kind of fever or something. A lot of them died in the hospital of fever. But anyway, the surgeon suggested that they release him and let him come home. I think he pretty well decided that he didn't have long to live, and you know, if he could make it home, let him die at home. So Uncle Dave Carter took off coming home. I guess he caught rides every way he could with somebody in a wagon. He might have rode the train part of the way. But anyway, he got home and revived, and I think it was all this, maybe drinking swamp water and eating sweet potatoes and good grits and some good hog meat. So we had plenty of hogs back then. But Uncle Dave was a real country boy, and a lot of people say, well, I never seen a grown man going barefoot. Back in those days, a lot of men went barefoot because they saved their shoes for going to town and going to church and cold weather. So anyway, Uncle Dave was out in his little garden he had, and he was a hoeing away, and a ground rattler bit him on the little toe. Well, he didn't think much about it. He chopped the snake's head off, and ground rattler today is more commonly called a pygmy rattler. They don't get, maybe 12 inches long or so, but he's got the same venom as the big rattlers have. He's got a little spots all over him, but you see him a lot of times at night. You can see him crossing the roads, and especially if it gets a little cooler. I think the sand must be a little warm or something, but anyway, they like to get up on the clear road sometimes. I've killed a lot of them when they were crossing the road. But anyway, he went to the house and got his turpentine. Everybody had a bottle of turpentine. Turpentine was the cure-all, a panacea for everything. He daubed turpentine on it. It soaked up, but it swelled up. The whole foot swelled up. So after 2 or 3 days, his wife, Hannah, he married Hannah Cox first time, and that reminds me, don't let us get to talk about Aunt Annie, the second wife. Uncle Dave went uptown and he went to the first doctor he saw. I don't know if it was old Dr. Folks or what, but anyway, the doctor told him that that toe would have to come off, that it was already mortified. Now, the term mortified back then was what we call gangrene today. And he told him he'd take the toe off for $5. He said, good gracious, Doc, $5? And you can't save him a toe. He said, I'll have to think about that. The doc said, well, don't think too long, son. That thing can go all over your body. Directly, we have to take your foot off. He said, I'll let you know tomorrow next day. So he went back to the house and he got him a little piece of fat lighter. He whittled him up a few splinters and built him a little fire down by his doorstep. Got his wood chisel out and his wet rock, and he went to sharpening that chisel. And then he had an old keg, I think it was. The band on it was about gone, so he got him a piece of, broke him off a little bit of the band, and he put it in the fire, and when he thought it was hot enough, he took his wood chisel and his hammer, put his foot on the doorstep, and he chopped his toe off. And then he stuck that hot iron to it. So it got well. And Uncle Dave lost his toe, as the doctor was going to take it off. But the biggest thing with Uncle Dave, he still had his $5. Now $5 back then went a long ways with a country boy. And some people might say, well, you mean he just chopped his toe off? They didn't have to bite the bullet or nothing? Nope. Uncle Dave, you gotta remember, Uncle Dave had done seen the war, and he'd done seen all kinds of horrors. He'd seen men lose legs and arms, and they tell him what all he had seen while he was away. But anyway, Uncle Dave's foot got well, and he went on to doing his things that he liked to do. Now, as he got older, he decided he wanted to move, so he moved over across Black River over on towards Ruskin. And just out from Ruskin, it was a booming town then in this area until you got down to Glenmore. He was living near Ruskin and on the other side of Black River. So he ordered him a wife. He was reading in the paper. There was a column where there was a little woman in Savannah that wanted a husband, and she was willing to marry him if somebody would pay her way over here. So Uncle Dave, I guess, got a money order or something and sent. She got her a ticket and got on the train, and he picked her up here in 09. Or he might have no, she probably got off at Ruskin, because the train stopped somewhere. Anyway, he met her and they went home, and one day they were decided to come to Ruskin to shop. And he didn't have much money, so he set him a treadle trap and caught him about, I think 15 or 20 partridges. Nowadays we all call them quail, but back then they were a bobwhite partridge. And by the way, he's still a bobwhite partridge, but we picked up the Yankee term quail. And anyway, she went to hunting hen nest, and she had her 4 or 5 dozen eggs gathered up. So they decided, all right, boy, they'd go and trade their eggs and their birds at Ruskin. And they got to, and it had been raining. Boy, I tell you, we had some of them toad stranglers, you might say. And Black River was what they call on the horse. I mean, and it was up. But they had a foot log across it. A tree had fallen, and he decided to walk the foot log. And so he said, "Now you be careful, Annie." Said, "We'll be all right." So they were walking, and she was ahead of him, and she slipped and fell. And she thought she was a drowning, and there wasn't anything for him to do but to throw his birds down and jump in and get her. And so he got her out, and they was all soaked, but then they had to go back home, so they missed out on that trip to Ruskin. They lost the birds and the eggs in Black River. Later on, Aunt Annie survived Uncle Dave. Of course, she was a good little woman, and she, at the time, she moved back over here, down from Uncle Walt Tatum's, and she was living in a little shanty down there. And she would come with Uncle Walt and Aunt Ada and Riley. And we'll have to talk about Riley sometime. Uncle Walt's a wild man, and I'll tell y'all some stories about Riley. But anyway, they would stop at our little grocery store in the edge of town, and when on the way back, they'd stop and get groceries. And I got to talk with Aunt Annie because she liked, I was just a young boy, about 13, and she liked for me to help her gather up her rations. And she got to the sweet potato bin, boy, she took her time. Boy, she liked to pick out her sweet potatoes. And that's another thing that we don't see people eating as much of today as they used to. Everybody, some people, especially the swamp people, would eat sweet potatoes 2 and 3 times a day. I mean, they just love sweet potatoes. My granddad Thrift thought if you didn't have a sweet potato, you were really in bad shape. But poor Aunt Annie finally died. Yeah, but I had a lot of good memories of those old folks. I tell you what, being raised partially in the grocery store on the way to town from the Swamp Road runs into Glass Street, right into Gilmore Street, and Gilmore, we used to be one of the main streets or main arteries. Gilmore and Brunel. Matter of fact, all the lawyers and doctors and all the prominent business people lived on Brunel and Gilmore for a long time, up until I guess the 1940s, and then some of them started building in different places out, and then Cherokee Heights came into being, and a lot of them moved out there. But there was another story you wanted me to tell, Chad. What else was I supposed to tell you about today?
The hog.
Oh,
But we're going to finish this one.
Okay.
Go ahead and exit this one.
All right. Well, we talked about Uncle Dave Carter, who was a character. Oh, let me tell you, I'm glad you said something. The biggest thing about Uncle Dave Carter, all the old people used to talk about, yeah, they sent Uncle Dave home to die. He died after he was 105 years old. Born in 1842, and they buried him in 1947. And he's buried out here near on the Needham Road at the Little Piney Grove Cemetery. 105 years old Uncle Dave lived to be. Without that too. All right. We'll wrap that up and give me a breath and we'll start another.